Hello and a very warm welcome to my YouTube station where we have a lot of focus on foreign policy issues, particularly India's relations with important partners, friends, frenemies. All these labels do not stick around anymore in today's fast shifting, changing world where you're seeing such rapid developments. And for this broadcast, I decided to take a little break away from the India-Pakistan unfolding story and whatever is happening there. A series of conversations that I have been doing, of course, in Hindi and English both. They're there on the channel. Please, if you have time, go through the videos. If you like them, share, subscribe to the YouTube station, and make sure to press on the bell icon notification so that you're alerted every time that we are live. Now, let me just play out a little video for you before I first talk about the topic for today, which is, of course, India-Canada relations, because we've seen a very, very interesting development happen in the Canadian political spectrum in the last few months itself. And there has been a surprise, in fact, victory for Justin Trudeau's party, Liberal Party, which otherwise in the run-up to the polls, it seemed like it would have done very badly and Pierre Poilievre would have become the new, in fact, Prime Minister of Canada. That did not happen. Here's what was the campaign slogan for the now elected Prime Minister, Carney. Let's listen in first.
Right now, the crisis in the United States doesn't stop at their borders.
Now an imminent threat for Canada's economy.
5% tariffs on all goods. Beginning to feel like 2008.
They can become divided and weak. But this is Canada. And we decide what happens here. Let's choose to be united and strong. Canada strong.
So after the entire shadow of the Trudeau years and the controversies that happened both internally and, of course, on the foreign policy stage, in particular, all the controversies that rocked the India-Canada relations too during this term, people thought that really the Liberals would be washed out in elections. But there is an individual called Donald Trump who made it happen. And Carney had a lot to thank him for, because when Donald Trump went ahead and said that Canada would be the 51st state of the United States of America, it added as a glue point really for this campaign that you saw, the slogan of which was, "We will make Canada stronger and more united." Now, let me just tell you as to who really is Carney that we are talking about, and give me a moment to pull up my graphics here. So if you talk about Carney, who has replaced So looks like we are back here. We were talking about who really is Carney. Now, if you look at it, he's 60-year-old. He's Canada's 24th Prime Minister. He was elected the leader of the Liberal Party, and he replaced Trudeau as Prime Minister in March this year. He was also elected subsequently in the elections that happened. Now, his image is that of, as I said, a lot of people tend to draw these comparisons between him and Dr. Manmohan Singh, that they were quintessentially the outsiders to politics, not really the politicians, but the economist politicians. And he was appointed to the Bank of Canada as governor in 2007, which was a very crucial period because Carney led the central banks and Canadian economy during the 2008 financial crisis. Subsequently, he was also elected in the lead role as far as the Bank of England was concerned in 2013. And there also his leadership really helped steer UK through Brexit, the political, the financial turbulence that followed. He was also the first non-British person to head that central bank in more than 300 years of its history. In 2020, he joined as the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. So there's a lot of span of as far as his body of work is concerned, and he won these elections. So to try and understand what really Carney is bringing to the table, how are things going to pan out, both for Canada domestically and particularly when it comes to the India-Canada relations. Let me bring on stage my guest here who's joining me from Ottawa today, Vina Nadjibulla. She is with the Canada, in fact, the Asia Pacific Foundation in Canada, a very, very senior expert when it comes to geopolitics, foreign policy. She's their vice president as well. Many thanks, Vina, for joining me early morning from Ottawa today.
Good morning from Ottawa, and thank you so much for the invitation, Smita. Nice to see you again.
Lovely to see you as well. If I could start by asking you, have the Liberals actually sent that thank you note to President Trump yet?
No, you're absolutely right, Smita, that this has been a really dynamic few months here in Ottawa politics. And we do have now a new government. In fact, last week, we also had the announcement of the new cabinet. So things are really set for a new direction for Canada. So yes, Prime Minister Carney and President Trump did have their first meeting, but I'm not sure he thanked them. But it was a really productive meeting nonetheless.
So what's the mood like as far as, within Canada is concerned? I mean, he came in at a time when there was, the problems had just mounted to new levels, whether it was the domestic economy, whether it was the foreign policy controversies. What's the mood like as far as the ordinary Canadians are concerned right now?
I think a few weeks ago, the mood was much more tense. Now with the election behind us, with the new prime minister, new cabinet, the meeting in Washington that was seen from Canada's perspective, at least, to have gone relatively well. I think there's this feeling that this is a challenging time, but that Canada has a plan, and people are so solidly behind the new government and this idea that we need to first build a much more united and stronger Canada here at home. So the slogan that you hear often from the Prime Minister and his new team is one Canadian economy, not 13, sort of referring to the fact that we are a confederation and provincially things had been really sort of separate before. But the idea that we need to bring one Canadian economy, deal with all the kind of internal things, the trade barriers internally, so the things that are in Canada's control ostensibly, and then from that position of unity and strength to negotiate with the US a new security and economic relationship, because our geography won't change. I mean, the US will forever be our neighbor and also an important economic and security partner. So that won't change either, but we do need a new relationship given that we're in a new moment. And President Trump has said that he wants to renegotiate how US relates to its allies, to its foes alike, right? So, I mean, of course, India is in the same position. Everybody else is in that same position of finding a new normal with the US.
I do understand that, of course, President Donald Trump has had previous meetings with Mark Carney in several rooms, in different rooms. So there is that personal history too. Do you feel like US has also already reduced its rhetoric and is, starting to sound a little bit more mature when it comes to its conversations with Canada now?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's been a marked shift in tone, certainly from President Trump, but also in general. I mean, you saw that the meeting in the Oval Office between Prime Minister and the President went relatively well. I mean, President Trump said all the things that you would expect him to say, that he loves Canada, that Canada is a good friend, and that he respects Prime Minister Carney. He stopped calling Canada's Prime Minister governor, which is, I think, what he was doing with Prime Minister Trudeau. So yes, there has been an absolute shift. I think that's not entirely surprising in that for President Trump, so much of this is very much personal, right? So he values personal relationships. He can change his mind quickly. So it seems like for now, he very much seems to like Prime Minister Carney. We'll see how long that lasts, but the relationship right now seems to be good.
Yeah, both of them, as in the photograph, they seem to be giving a thumbs up, at least for now, to the relationship. Yes. But coming to, Carney's cabinet, which was announced just a few days ago, and there are a couple of interesting faces, especially also when it comes to people of Indian origin. There is a very strong Indian diaspora in Canada. And the most prominent voice right now would be that of Anita Anand, who has been elected as the foreign minister. Let's just hear her swearing in a little bit.
And sincerely promise and swear that I will truly and faithfully and to the best of my skill and knowledge execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Moi, Indira Anita Anand, je promets et jure solennellement et sincèrement qu'au mieux de ma
Okay, so Anita Anand there, Vina, born to immigrant parents who were doctors, and she's also served in different positions in the past too. So she comes with a lot of ministerial experience. Tell us about some of the more interesting picks in the cabinet, from an India perspective to our viewers.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that Minister Anand, of course, is going to be the most prominent person of Indian heritage in this cabinet. She does bring a ton of experience, obviously, most notably as the Minister of Defense. So at that point, she was minister when our Indo-Pacific strategy came about. So she's quite familiar with the region and obviously also relations with India. She also has a really impressive background professionally as a professor, as a lawyer. So we are quite excited to have such an experienced person. It's such a difficult moment for international relations. Our Minister of Trade is also of Indian heritage, as is the Minister of State for Development. So pretty much everybody in kind of the international relations sphere would be from with Indian heritage. In general, I think it's a really strong cabinet in that it tries to have some people from experience. So obviously it's the Liberal Party. Prime Minister Carney is new, but he's still a Liberal. So about half of people who made it to cabinet were also there under Prime Minister Trudeau. Excuse me. And then there are a number of people who are new. So it's a nice balance of new and old in cabinet.
Right. I mean, we also have Maninder Sidhu, who's the International Trade Minister.
Yes.
There are two others of Indian descent as Secretaries of State, which is basically Ministers of State in the Indian parlance.
Junior minister,
and
yeah.
Junior ministers. So really, tell us, as you mentioned, that a lot of the faces are also faces who were there in the previous Liberal cabinet too. Will there be a new pivot to India relations, or will a lot of the baggage from the past still stand as it were?
I think if you sort of pay attention to Canadian news, there is an opportunity for a reset. The tone has really shifted, and you're hearing during the election campaign, both Carney and Polyev were speaking about India in a different way. I mean, sort of noting that both for its own reasons of significance, but also given that the world is really changing and President Trump is making everyone look at their foreign policy and look at other partnerships. I think there is now a political window of opportunity to set a new tone in Canada-India relations. Now, that's not going to sort of mean that everything that had been plaguing the relationship will go away. So I think we still have serious issues that need to be addressed, but this is a moment of opportunity. And given the significance of the relationship, both from an economic and people-to-people perspective, I think the next few weeks and months do offer that opportunity. And certainly from Canada's side, there's that willingness. From our perspective, kind of listening to some of the messages coming out of Delhi as well. So certainly Prime Minister Modi's congratulatory remarks on Carney's election, Minister Jaishankar's remarks to Minister Anand's election. So those were all seen here in Canada and Ottawa as potentially positive signals and a willingness for a reset on both sides.
Right. You did mention that tweet from Prime Minister Modi that came in pretty early on, and where he wrote that congratulations on your election as the Prime Minister of Canada. This was on 29th April. It was interesting that he spoke about India and Canada are bound by shared democratic values, a steadfast commitment to the rule of law, and vibrant people-to-people ties, which did look like, there would be an opportunity for reset sooner than later, given that how much had changed in the landscape in the last few years, particularly since the relationship literally blew up after, Prime Minister Trudeau went onto the stage in Parliament and leveled those very serious allegations against India's external agency, the RAW, in terms of the assassination attempt and assassination of a Canadian citizen, but a Khalistani, leader. So really, at the moment, do you think India will be a priority for this government, or it's still going to take some time before Carney and Anita Anand can both start to focus on the India relation?
I think both Prime Minister Carney and his cabinet members understand that Canada needs to deepen what they call relations with like-minded partners in Europe and Asia. So I think obviously Europe, there's historic relations. It's easier for Canada, and that's where the outreach has started. So Prime Minister has traveled to the UK and to France, and of course has now been to Italy as well on the occasion of the new Pope's inaugural sermon. So I think with Europe, that's all well in hand. The question really becomes how quickly can Canada move also to deepen relations in Asia? And when we look at Asia, of course, for Canada, Japan, South Korea, those are historically good relations. And Japan is also a member of G7. So I think there will be opportunities to deepen relations there. And then the next, of course, set of relations are with India and with Southeast Asia. I think that's where also the opportunities will be. So we will definitely see that there is a desire. I think two things will need to be watched in June. One is the G7 meeting that's taking place here in Canada and who will be invited to that and whether Prime Minister Modi receives an invitation. I think that could be a really critical moment. And then the second is the political messaging from Ottawa around the anniversary of the Air India bombing, which is also in June. And this year it's the 40th anniversary. So I think messaging and signaling there would be important. And then, of course, what Canada will be watching is how India responds to both of these developments, how India speaks about cooperating on the critical law enforcement issues. So what Canada would like is India's cooperation on the Nijjar murder case, as well as the broader allegations that Indian authorities had been involved in violent crimes here in Canada targeting the Khalistani activists. So I think from Canada's perspective, we'll be watching signaling around that issue. So how Prime Minister Modi and his government sort of speak about that and the willingness to cooperate with Canada. And then, of course, I think on the economic side, things have been moving ahead, notwithstanding the political issues. So the opportunities there are significant. And I think businesses would very much welcome a change in the political tone.
Right, but I think a lot of our audiences will have questions revolving around the issue that kind of, led to that severe decline in relations. Kabir is asking that, there was the rise of the Khalistani elements and then open support and space from Trudeau. Now, in the election results, if we see the way the NDP has lost, Jagmeet Singh has actually stepped down. Is that changing the narrative on the Khalistan issue in terms of, whether it really has electoral benefits at the end of the day or not?
I think it's less about that and more sort of looking at the fact that Canada needs to move to have a relationship with India that's not defined by a single issue. Because I don't think there's been a significant change on the challenging issue, so to speak, right? So the difficult issue is still there, but there's now an opening to say we need to work through that and that the relationship writ large needs to be about more than just this element. So that's, I think, the opening. But otherwise, the Canadian case has not changed. Canada still is asking for India's cooperation on this issue and recognizing also that there needs to be a lot more to rebuild trust among our law enforcement. It's not just about the Nijjar assassination. I think the issues go back 40 years. To mistrust and kind of the disappointment that I think India felt with how Canada handled Air India bombing investigation. So there are long-standing issues that need to be addressed, but what we need for now is a commitment from both sides to work on that, right? To create a separate track among our law enforcement officials, a mechanism for them to be able to both build confidence and rebuild trust, but also to actually find accountability and justice for this issue.
Let me just play out, in fact, a comment that was made again by Justin Trudeau in November last year when things had started to change and the relationship had really sort of crumbled. There was a diplomatic, tit for tat that had happened. And
there are many supporters of Khalistan in Canada, but they do not represent the Sikh community as a whole. But they do not represent all Hindu Canadians as a whole.
It's just one of the many controversial statements that Trudeau seems to have developed a habit of making. In a similar breath, trying to bracket in the Khalistanis and Hindu Canadian supporters of Modi. It was a strange thing to say. Has there been any sort of introspection within the Liberal Party that, yes, there is a case that deals with law and order, that the courts will have to do what they have to do, but the political messaging of how things were being put out, do you think there was actually an introspection within the party, or they've been too busy with what was happening domestically on the economic front?
Yeah, I can't speak for the Liberal Party. Obviously, I'm not in the party in that way, but
I mean, whatever you have understood through your conversation.
Yes. I mean, I think what I can say is, though, that there has been a reckoning in Canada over the last few months that we need to have a much better understanding of India, of its complexity, of the issues, even here in Canada, in terms of the diversity of our own diaspora community, that there's many different voices, many different interests, and that while that element is important, that again, the relationship with India needs to be defined from a national interest perspective. And Smita, this is a larger conversation about Canada's foreign policy writ large, right? That in the past, sort of, and with many countries, it was kind of the diaspora and certain voices within the diaspora, the loudest voices that were setting the tone for the relationship, be that with Sri Lanka, be that with China, be that with India, and so forth. And now there's a recognition that given how serious the current moment is geopolitically, that Canada can't afford to let only diaspora interests drive its foreign policy, that we need an overall approach to foreign policy that's grounded in our national interests, that upholds national values rather than or beholden to any particular group. So I think that kind of recognition now is really kind of a wider spread than it used to be. And I'm hopeful that in that context, the relationship with India would also be seen from a broader perspective rather than the voices of the few, which matter. I mean, I'm not diminishing those voices, but they're part of the conversation rather than being the sole sort of decision makers in the relationship.
I mean, as Kabir has the follow-up question, that was there a feeling that you were perhaps risking your international relations by, in lieu of national local gains?
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's not unusual in parliamentary democracies for certain voices to be very strong at kind of local elections, ridings. This is part of the system that we have, and in some ways, it's great because we do have a lot more accountability, or sort of every voice matters and every vote counts. That is all great, but then when it comes to policy making and setting the tone in a bilateral relationship with India, with China, with any place really, it should be the national interest that drives that rather than domestic politics. And I think that recognition is now understood. There is that recognition here, and that's understood in Canada. It doesn't mean that means tomorrow the relations with India will improve automatically. We still need to work at it, and we still need to address national security concerns from both sides. I think it would be fair to say that the most challenging element of the relationship is the perceived threats to national security. Canada felt that the assassination of Nijjar, no matter what the man's background or credentials, but killing a Canadian on a Canadian soil is a violation of our sovereignty and a major threat. And obviously, from India's perspective, the fact that India believes Canada hasn't taken its national security concerns seriously, hasn't addressed the issue of Khalistan extremism, that's also obviously a national security concern. So that needs to be dealt with. But then beyond that, both countries need each other. India needs partners that can bring capital, that can bring technology, that can bring resources, innovation to the table to meet its national objectives of economic growth and development. And Canada needs reliable partners around the world to diversify our trading relations and to be able to build real partnerships with others, not just with the US. So I think it's in the interest of both countries to rebuild the relationship. And to do that, we need to build trust. We need to take issues one at a time and have an approach that says it's the national interests and national values that would drive it rather than one set of issues or one set of the diaspora.
We also saw that message coming from Canada, of course, following the brutal Pahalgam terrorist attack where 626 tourists were killed. But Canada took a while to sort of respond to it. Was it only because of the transition that was happening? I mean, the statement did come in, but it did take some time for that statement to come in.
Yes, it was during our election process in the transition. So I think that's why the actual statement condemning the terrorist attack took a few days. But then, of course, you also saw Canada lead an effort through the G7 that also condemned the attack, but also called for restraint and de-escalation at the time when the tensions were especially high between India and Pakistan, sort of a couple of weeks ago, I guess now.
So that statement actually raised a few eyebrows here too, because it was the feeling that you're back to hyphenating what India says is, you're basically balancing out the perpetrators of terror with the victims of terror and trying to call out for restraint, whereas there should have been perhaps a more stronger stand for India's right to defend itself.
I understand that India felt disappointed with the diplomatic response of most of its partners, including the US for that matter. So I don't think Canada was alone in that kind of statement. I think with the exception of Israel, perhaps everyone else ended up in that place. And that's something that I think India will now need to deal with on the diplomatic front, because the narrative around everything that transpired, both with the attack and then also obviously with the escalation and tensions, I think arguably is a setback diplomatically for India, because you're right, we're back to that hyphenated understanding rather than dealing with India as a rising power in the Indo-Pacific and bilaterally. So, but that wasn't unique to Canada. And I think it's something that India would need to look into, how that happened and why the narrative was the way it was around the world, not just in Canada.
So, moving forward, you said that we'll have to see one of the first earliest opportunities for Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Carney to meet would perhaps be that G7 meeting. So far in the last few years, India has been a constant special invitee. It would be pretty surprising to see that invitation not coming through to New Delhi. Are there any reasons that you see at this point in time that could, see that the invitation actually doesn't come through?
You're right that India has been there, I believe, since 2019 consistently. So I think the only reason it wouldn't happen would be if the G7 is very small and really only the actual members. And for a while, there was talk of that, given sort of the disruptions and the challenges of dealing with the new policies of President Trump. There was talk that it would be much smaller G7, and also given that Prime Minister Carney would have been very new to the role. So if that's the case, then yes, there would be very few invitation, and perhaps Prime Minister Modi wouldn't be invited. But if the G7 includes other partners, other invited guests, then I think there's a high chance that Prime Minister Modi will in fact be invited, given the significance of India as a global player.
What are the three key areas where you think that India-Canada can actually start to sort of focus more right now, even as the controversial issues stay and they find ways to deal with it? Of course, perhaps more behind the scene, not so much openly and so vocally. But what are the three key areas that you think are currently going to be the focus areas as far as that reset? Because if I'm not mistaken, I don't think Mr. Carney has met Mr. Modi so far. I could be mistaken. But do you read anything into his statements in India so far? Is there something to show us that what lies ahead?
Yes, I think for Canada and perhaps for India as well, right now, the focus will be on economic partnerships, right? So protecting our economies with respect to the tariffs and the changes that the US is introducing into the global trading system, and building in resilience and diversifying relationships. So I think economic relations do offer us the best opportunity to begin to rebuild the relationship from. And there, obviously for now, we have paused the trade negotiations on the early progress trade agreement. I think resuming those discussions would be sort of the first step. Even before that, perhaps we need to also move ahead on the resumption of high commissioners. So as you know, for the moment, we don't have high commissioners in Delhi and in Ottawa. So I think moving on that front politically, sort of reinstating high commissioners and then starting the economic conversations and looking to see how those discussions perhaps need to be reshaped, right? So now we're all focusing on economic security, on supply chains, on critical minerals, technology. So starting from there, I think could be critical. But then in the meantime, really encouraging the kind of the subnational dialogue that has been happening, right? Our conversation, Smita, has focused on kind of a federal government, so Delhi, Ottawa challenges, but we have to acknowledge that at the subnational level, a lot of positive things have already been happening. If you look at provinces like Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Canada, our premiers have been coming to India regularly, have been engaging on things like energy, agriculture, and deepening those kinds of relations. So I think we'll need to see that and redoubling of effort in that way. And then the final element is, I think, there's an interest also from Canada's universities to rebuild relations and to shift gears, not just, or to shift the focus from kind of the number of students coming to Canada to actual research partnerships and perhaps opening campuses in India and developing a new type of relationship in the educational sector. So I think those would be things that in 2025 we could see some movement on. So more business delegations from both countries, more delegations at the university level, greater engagement at the subnational level, so both in India and in Canada, and then sort of some early signals on the political reset with the G7 and the high commissioners.
In the last few months, and these are just the part of the last two questions for you, Vina, we did see Canada step up a lot of, protectionist measures, or at least checks on immigrants, even, which has been a similar tone now for a lot of the global capitals with, the rise of leaders, strongman leaders as well. If you could just tell our viewers as to what were some of these key immigrant changes that impacted Indians and Indian students.
Yeah, so in Canada, similar to other places, notably Australia, UK, elsewhere, after COVID, we really started to experience affordability crisis and a housing crisis. So in Canada, it was both sort of the prices going up, but also housing becoming an issue, led then to a conversation about our levels of immigration and how many people were coming in, both on student visas, but also temporary work visas and so forth. And there was a period a couple of years ago where that level of newcomers became unsustainable because most of them were going to the same few cities. So like I live in Vancouver, and it was just becoming really unaffordable. Same with Toronto. Those kind of urban centers, particularly those two, saw things like, students not finding housing and having to live many people to small apartments and so forth. So, and that then led to calls on the government of the day at the time, Trudeau government, to put in a cap on the number of students that were coming in and a number of temporary visas that were going to be given. The Liberal government also has said that they will continue to look at those caps and to kind of manage the number of immigrants and newcomers to Canada. But I think I have to note that different from many other places, and I myself am an immigrant, I can say this, in Canada, the kind of general public attitude is still quite positive and receptive. And there's an understanding that for Canada to meet its economic objectives, it needs immigrants, that immigrants and Canada's diversity is a source of our strength. So I think the general attitude is still very much open and supportive, but there is a housing issue and an affordability issue that was at the root of why the changes happened to the immigration policy. And I think if you listen to Prime Minister Carney, in addition to dealing with tariffs and President Trump, his number one priority is housing. I mean, Canadians, and in fact, actually immigrant Canadians, so those who are new and first generation perhaps here, they're the ones who are most concerned about that because they're the ones who are renting and can't afford housing. So it's a kind of it's more of an economic issue than potentially an anti-immigrant issue, where in Canada we still don't have that. Now that could change. I don't take it for granted, but for now, I think Canada is still a welcoming place.
But, you did mention that there would be a focus on more educational ties, on more university collaborations. But in the last couple of months, between all the controversies, we did see, sharp declines in visa applications. Also, the entire narrative, that was put out saying that not all is rosy for students there, and it's really tough. And of course, there are also institutes that are duping students. It's working both ways. How much do you think in terms of the Indian students who are coming into Canada, how much has that suffered because of the political sort of controversy?
Yes, I think we definitely saw a decline in the number of applications also from India. And I think I'm not sure how much of that is now the political controversies versus some of the narratives that were being promoted on social media and media about Canada being unsafe or unwelcoming to Indian students. And I think with that, both sides, certainly Canada and India, we need to do much more to tell the full story and the truth, basically. Yes, there are some bad actors, some colleges that took advantage of the system, but by and large, I mean, Canadian universities are still world-class. And I mean, I teach at the University of British Columbia, and we have many students. So it's the full picture, I think, is quite different. But even beyond that, I think we need to move just from kind of seeing Canada as an opportunity to come and study, or for Canadian universities kind of seeing Indian students as an opportunity to get higher foreign student tuition, move to a real partnership when it comes to research collaborations, technological collaborations. Like I said, open campuses in India, make sure that talent stays in India, while also obviously there is sort of managed numbers that are coming to Canada. So I think it's kind of looking at the new generation of research and educational partnerships, rather just then going back to fixing the old model, as I think where we should put our focus.
Right. There is somebody called Osho who has put this question, in fact, saying that there is so much of anti-globalism narrative across the world and anti-migrant narratives. How does the future policy seem towards it? You were, of course, talking about it, but do you see a further tightening of the immigration laws happening with this new government?
I don't know if we'll see further tightening. I think we'll see some tweaking to the policy in terms of making sure that it's not hurting actually Canada's research and innovation, because we also need talent from abroad. And obviously when it comes to STEM or technology, that talent is coming from India largely and from other parts of Asia. So there will be probably tweaks to the system. But again, to reinforce my message that in comparison to many places, certainly Europe, UK, elsewhere, in Canada, the general public's perceptions and attitudes toward immigration and towards diversity and inclusion is much more positive. In some ways, the re-election also of the Liberal government is a testament to that. So Canadians were rejecting the more kind of isolationist, more kind of Canada first narratives that maybe the opposition candidate was putting forward. I mean, you're almost seeing sort of a resurgence of kind of the value-based policies that saying diversity is good, also in contrast to what's happening in the US, I think, in some ways. So we'll see if that holds. But for now, I think Canada is still a country that understands that we need new talent to be able to grow our economy, and that Canada is essentially a multicultural society and where we do value diversity.
Just a final question there, because coming as far as to Anita Anand, the Indian origin is concerned, she's also the first Hindu Canadian to have, become the foreign minister now. And at one point, there was a lot of worries about the sort of backlash that one would see within the immigration community with what was happening with, seemingly the support of the Trudeau-led sections to the Khalistanis, numbers of Indian diplomats being leaked, all these rallies being held out, the protest marches, and then that there may just be a backlash between the Sikh and the Hindu communities within Canada itself as far as the diaspora was concerned. What is your reading of that situation, Vina?
Yes, we did have a little bit of that with some clashes in Brampton, if you recall, a few months back. But since then, things have stabilized. I think that's a really important element, because sometimes we speak about this only as kind of a bilateral issue and an irritant in India-Canada relations. But I think having social cohesion and making sure that we're not having intercommunal violence and tensions here in Canada is a critical priority for Canadians. You're right, we have a very strong diaspora community from South Asia and from India, and there have been some tensions. And that's something that should worry every Canadian, because we don't want to see that. And in order to avoid that, again, we need a lot more education and awareness. One thing that, for instance, our foundation does is put out publications that explain sort of the history of, let's say, Air India bombing, right? So because so few Canadians even understand that, or even the diversity of the kind of the diaspora population, the difference of views, the opinions. So we do surveys. Like I said, we have a number of publications that explain the significance of that relationship. So, and I think the kind of the violence that we did see a few months back was a wake-up call also to community leaders here in Canada, in British Columbia and Surrey, where there's a large population, as well as in Brampton, Ontario. So I think people recognize that whatever we may say about foreign relations and kind of challenges with India, having intercommunal violence is something that's really bad for Canada, and it's impacting every Canadian. And we need to move past that.
And the biggest sticking point in ties has been that how do you define this freedom of speech and expression? Because every time India would protest about these Khalistani marches, and not just that, but under the Vienna Convention, where security of your diplomats, in each other's countries is of prime importance. Numbers of consul generals getting leaked, their families' photographs getting leaked, physically them getting, drawn into balls if they are visiting someplace outside. Again, as I say, that while the Nijjar case, of course, is something that I'm sure will be in the courts. It is not something that is going to go away. Both the countries cannot wish it away. But having said that, will there be any sort of a rethinking on, there has to be some red line somewhere when you talk about freedom of speech and expression, so much so that it doesn't start to impact your ties with very important countries?
Yes, I mean, that has been a big point of debate. And you've heard me and others say publicly here that while obviously freedom of speech is protected, it's a charter right here, that there's a difference between something being illegal and something being politically un-Canadian or against our values, meaning that you don't have to outlaw something to be able to clearly come out and speak against it. And that's what we're inviting our political leaders to do more of, to more clearly draw the lines of what is acceptable discourse, right? So statements about like all Hindus should be sent back obviously is a violation of Canadian values and an affront to norms that we all now expect in our society in 2025. So there would be now a demand for political leaders to speak about that, right? It doesn't need to be outlawed as speech. Everybody has certain rights to be able to say what they want, but there's a line when it gets crossed, which can become hate speech. And of course, there are laws against that. But even before that, it doesn't have to be illegal for it to be something that is politically unacceptable. And I think that's where the debate is now moving, that there needs to be more political leadership shown in clearly naming things that glorify violence as being un-Canadian and unwelcome in our public discourse. And I think we're seeing that shift. But again, that's something that until recently wasn't really in the broader Canadian consciousness. These things would happen in certain parts during certain kind of religious day or celebrations, and was only really involving members of certain communities. So the broader public wasn't really aware of it, to be frank. I mean, it wasn't something that was part of their consciousness. So foundations like ours, what we're doing is we're raising visibility around that and sort of saying that, again, it's not about freedom of speech or one community, it's about Canadian values. And anything that glorifies violence is not part of those values and cannot be sort of normal in our political discourse.
Okay, I think you've spoken very clearly on the issue there and brought in your insights. And, there's just one last question somebody was asking about, will there be less bullying of Canada? I think we already spoke about that in terms of US-Canada relations, because Mr. Carney did stand up to Mr. Trump in his very presence and said that Canada is not up for sale. It's not going to be the 51st state of the United States. But it'll be interesting to watch as to what happens really next in terms of the India-Canada relationship, with so much at stake for the two countries, for our students, for the diaspora. For now, thank you so much, Vina. I know I overreached on the time that I had asked you for. My apologies for that, but it was an interesting conversation. So one, there were too many questions to ask.
No problem at all. It was a pleasure to join your program. And thank you so much for the invitation, Smita.
Thank you. Vina Nadjibulla there, the Vice President for Asia Pacific Foundation in Canada, joining me from Ottawa. And thank you so much to all our viewers who tuned in as well and asked your questions. Do remember to please subscribe to the channel, share the content if you like. There's a lot of bilingual content on foreign policy, on political issues as well. And make sure to press the bell icon notification for future alerts every time we live stream. Thank you, goodbye, and take care.